The Duke posed as a butler to spy on his fiancée. The confession he heard destroyed everything. Welcome, dear readers, to a journey through the mists of Regency England, where fragrant drawing rooms hide secrets deeper than the candlelight shadows. This is a story about painful truths, the masks we wear, and the transformative power of forgiveness. You will meet Charlotte, a young woman who carries the weight of a past mistake, and Alexander, an embittered duke who has built walls around his heart. When deception becomes the foundation of a marriage, is it possible that the truth, however painful, can set two imprisoned souls free? Prepare your hearts for a narrative where every glance carries volumes, every silence resonates louder than words, and where forgiveness does not erase scars, but transforms them into wisdom. Tell me, where are you watching us from? Leave your city in the comments. I want to know who the sensitive hearts are that accompany us on this literary journey. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Every gesture from you encourages us to bring more stories that touch the soul and cross time to teach us about ourselves. Spring of 1818, Sussex, England. The April rain fell gently on Pemberton Hall, each drop like a tear from the grey sky that stretched infinitely over Sussex. Charlotte Pemberton stood by the drawing-room window, her pale fingers tracing the path of the drops on the fogged glass, while her breath formed ephemeral mists that disappeared as quickly as they were born. She was 21, but her eyes carried the weight of decades. The letter rested on the mahogany desk, its red wax seal broken like an open wound. Marriage proposal. The words danced before her eyes whenever Charlotte tried not to think about them. Duke Alexander Thornfield. A name that sounded like stone and iron, cold and unshakable. The scent of lavender that permeated the faded curtains now seemed acrid, suffocating. Charlotte pressed her forehead against the cold glass, feeling the dampness seep into her skin. She remembered the time when these halls echoed with laughter, when her father's parties filled the house with music and light. Before the gambling, before the debts, before everything collapsed like a house of cards. Harriet, her younger sister, entered the room with the lightness of her 16 years, still untouched by the cruelty of the world. Her white muslin dress rustled softly like butterfly wings. Golden curls framed a face where innocence still blossomed. Charlotte turned, forcing a smile that didn't reach her brown eyes. "Is everything all right, Charlotte?" Harriet's voice was a worried whisper, delicate as falling petals. Charlotte nodded, her fingers clutching the pleats of her grey dress. She couldn't tell her sister about the weight she carried in her chest, that dark secret that woke her in cold sweats every night. Edmund Grey. The name burned like a live coal in her memory, an army officer with seductive eyes and empty promises. One night, a terrible mistake, made in a moment of silent despair, when the walls seemed to be closing in on her and the future presented itself as an endless corridor. Henry Sinclair, her previous fiancé, had found out. The public humiliation, the breakup, the scandal, hushed up only by the family's desperate intervention and by discretion, bought with the last reserves of dignity they possessed. Her father had lost everything at the gaming tables. The estate was mortgaged, the servants reduced to a minimum, the Persian rug sold, the family portraits pawned. The family's hopes rested on Charlotte's delicate shoulders like a leaden cloak. The marriage to the Duke was their salvation. It was also her sentence. Duke Thornfield is severe, they say, Charlotte murmured, more to herself than to her sister. A widower for 5 years, lost his wife and son in childbirth. It's said he's become reclusive, that he rarely leaves Ravenscroft Manor. Harriet approached, her blue eyes full of innocent concern. She held her sister's hand, feeling it cold as marble. But he chose you, Charlotte. That must mean something. He chose the Pemberton name, Charlotte thought bitterly. He chose the ancient lineage, the social position that money alone cannot buy. A duke enriched by trade, they said, seeking the respectability of an impoverished aristocratic family. He did not choose the broken woman hiding beneath silk dresses and polite smiles. He did not know the truth that could destroy everything. The afternoon advanced with the cruel slowness of time, when one awaits the inevitable. Charlotte watched the shadows lengthen across the worn oak floor, each tick-tock of the mantel clock a reminder that the future was approaching inexorably. That night, under the flickering light of candles that cast dancing shadows on the peeling walls, Charlotte wrote her reply. The quill scratched the parchment like claws scratching her heart. She accepted. The wedding would be at the end of May. 6 weeks to prepare her perfect mask. 6 weeks to bury her past under layers of decorum and composure. She sealed the letter with hands that trembled imperceptibly. The red wax looked like blood. What Charlotte didn't know, as the rain continued its melancholy song on the roof of Pemberton Hall, was that masks attract masks, and that the Duke had secrets of his own, kept in the shadows of Ravenscroft Manor, secrets that would soon intertwine with hers in ways neither of them could foresee. Ravenscroft Manor rose against the stormy sky like a fortress of stone and silence. Alexander Thornfield held Charlotte's letter of acceptance between fingers that, despite their firmness, trembled imperceptibly. 36 years old, widower, embittered. The words society used to define him echoed emptily in the corridors of his mind. Daniels, his 52-year-old butler with 22 years of loyal service, entered the study with the tea tray that Alexander rarely touched. The man knew every scar on his master's soul. Every night Alexander wandered the halls like a ghost in his own home. "Miss Pemberton has accepted, Your Grace," Daniels said, his deep voice carrying more than simple information. Alexander nodded, his eyes fixed on the fireplace where the flames danced hypnotically. Isabel's portrait still hung above the mantel, her painted eyes seeming to follow him with eternal sweetness. Isabel, perfect, gentle, dead. And with her his son James, who had lived only 2 fragile breaths before departing. 5 years. 5 years of guilt that gnawed at his insides like slow poison. If he had called the doctor sooner, if he had noticed the signs. If, the cruelest word in the human vocabulary. "Richard was here yesterday," Daniels murmured, breaking the heavy silence. "Asking about the succession." Alexander clenched his fists. Richard Thornfield, his cousin, an elegant parasite who squandered fortunes he didn't possess and accumulated debts like trophies. If Alexander died without an heir, everything would pass to that waste of a surname. The estate, the title, the lands his family had built over generations. "I need an heir," Alexander said, the words coming out like shards of glass. "And Lady Charlotte needs security," Daniels replied with the frankness of one who had known his master since boyhood. "It is a practical arrangement, Your Grace." Practical, as if marriage were a business transaction. But wasn't that exactly what it was? Charlotte Pemberton brought an impeccable lineage, serene beauty according to the portraits, and a family too desperate to refuse. Alexander offered fortune, position, salvation, but something was eating at Alexander from within, a suspicion born from years of seeing the falseness behind social smiles. What if she was as they whispered about other high society women? A fortune hunter, skilled in pretense. What if she hid a calculating nature beneath those supposedly innocent eyes? The idea emerged like a serpent, slithering through the shadows of his mind, to know her true nature. Not the polished, presentable version she would offer a duke, but the real person unguarded, when she thought no one of importance was watching. Alexander stood up abruptly, the chair scraping the mahogany floor. "Daniels, I need your help in a delicate matter." The butler arched an eyebrow, waiting. "I am going to Pemberton Hall, but not as a duke." Alexander turned, and for the first time in years something that could be mistaken for life shone in his grey eyes. "I will go as a butler. Thomas, let's say, sent to assist with the wedding preparations." Daniels remained silent for a moment, processing the madness of the proposal. Then slowly he nodded. "It is risky, Your Grace. If they find out—" "They won't find out," Alexander cut in. 2 weeks. That's all I need to see who she really is. And if you don't like what you find—" Alexander looked again at Isabel's portrait. She would never have disappointed him. She was perfect. But she was dead, and he was alive, chained to the needs of the living world. "Then at least I will know who I am marrying," he replied, his voice rough as gravel. 3 days later, as spring began to paint the fields with renewed green, a man dressed in simple but impeccable clothes approached Pemberton Hall. He introduced himself as Thomas, a new temporary butler sent by Duke Thornfield to assist with the preparations. No one suspected that this man with broad shoulders and observant eyes was the groom himself. And so it was that Alexander Thornfield, Duke and embittered widower, crossed the threshold of Pemberton Hall in disguise, unaware that this decision would break and rebuild everything he thought he knew about love, betrayal, and redemption. Thomas's first days at Pemberton Hall were ones of silent observation. Alexander, disguised under the simple name and discreet posture of a butler, moved through the worn corridors of the house with the precision of someone studying an ancient manuscript. Charlotte Pemberton was exactly what one would expect of a lady. Elegant without being ostentatious, polite without being effusive, composed as a porcelain figure. She oversaw the wedding preparations with quiet efficiency, her delicate hands moving between fabric samples and guest lists. She never raised her voice to the servants. She never showed impatience or arrogance. Too perfect, Alexander thought as he polished non-existent silver or organized correspondence. Something about that perfection bothered him like a stone in his shoe. No one was so serene, so controlled, without hiding something underneath. It was on a May afternoon, as the scent of lilacs drifted in through the open windows, that the house of cards began to crumble. Lady Beatrice Ashford arrived in an ornate carriage, her blue satin dress whispering against the floor. She was Charlotte's close friend since childhood, a 23-year-old woman with shrewd eyes and a smile that held secrets. The two retired to the tea room, and the door closed behind them with a soft click. Alexander Thomas was in the adjacent corridor, organizing silverware in a nearby cabinet. It was not his intention to eavesdrop, or so he told himself. The feminine voices filtered through the slightly open door, soft as the clinking of porcelain. Trivial conversation about dresses, flowers, table arrangements, until Beatrice lowered her voice, and something in the change of tone made Alexander freeze. "Did you tell him?" Beatrice asked, and there was genuine concern in her words. Silence, long, heavy as lead. "I can't." Charlotte's voice came out broken, so different from her usual composure that Alexander almost didn't recognize it. "Beatrice, how can I? He would never forgive me." "Charlotte, dearest, it was 8 months ago. The scandal was hushed up. Henry kept silent after the sum your family paid. No one needs to know about my betrayal." Charlotte let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "About the fact that I betrayed my engagement with an officer who seduced me with pretty words, on a night when I felt suffocated by the weight of impossible expectations." Alexander's world tilted on its axis. "It was Edmund Grey," Charlotte continued, and now there were tears in her voice. "Captain Edmund Grey, a terrible moment of weakness. He was charming, said everything I needed to hear, that I was more than a dowry, more than a commodity. And I, God forgive me, believed him. For one night I allowed myself to be foolish. Henry found out," Beatrice said softly. "Henry found out and destroyed my name in society. Only the money my family didn't have managed to silence him. And now," Charlotte's voice choked, "now I am going to marry Duke Thornfield, a man who knows nothing about my stained past. I'm going to lie to him every day of our marriage." Alexander gripped the silver tray hard enough to leave marks. Blood pulsed in his temples like war drums. Every word was a stab, every confession a renewed betrayal. "Never tell him." Beatrice's voice was firm now, pragmatic. "Men do not forgive these things, Charlotte. No matter the circumstances, no matter the regret. Be the perfect wife he expects. Give him heirs. Bury the past where no one can dig it up. And live a lie for the rest of my life," Charlotte whispered. "Live a life," Beatrice corrected. "Save your family. Save yourself. The past is past. What matters is the future." There was a long moment of silence, punctuated only by the sound of tea being poured, cups clinking delicately. Then Charlotte spoke, her voice now composed, cold as marble. "You are right. The Duke will never know. I will be the wife he expects, perfect, flawless, empty." Alexander retreated from the hallway before they could hear him. His steps were automatic, his body moving on instinct while his mind fragmented into 1,000 sharp pieces. Betrayal, lies, deceit. The words echoed like funeral bells. She was exactly what he had feared. A woman with secrets, with a sordid past, hidden under polite smiles. A consummate actress who would deceive him for the rest of their lives if he allowed it. Alexander locked himself in his temporary room, fists clenched, breath ragged. Isabel would never have betrayed him. Isabel was pure, honest, perfect. And now she was being replaced by a woman who built her future on foundations of lies. The irony did not completely escape him. He himself was lying, disguised spying, but he justified it by saying it was to protect himself, to discover the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was uglier than he had imagined. That night, Alexander wrote a letter to Daniels. He would reveal his true identity in a week as planned. He would marry Charlotte Pemberton as agreed, but it would be a marriage in name only. She wanted to save her family. She would have his money. She wanted position. She would have his title. But she would never have his heart, his respect, his trust. She would never have the man behind the Duke. And Charlotte Pemberton, meanwhile, lay awake in her room that night, staring at the damp-stained ceiling, carrying the weight of a secret that was slowly crushing her. Unaware that the man judging her so harshly was the same one who served her tea with respectful hands. Unaware that the approaching future would be far more complex than either of them could imagine. Destiny, after all, has a peculiar sense of irony. The wedding day dawned under an uncertain sky, white clouds vying for space with grey patches that threatened rain. Charlotte Pemberton woke to the sound of birds singing, indifferent to the weight she carried on her shoulders. The wedding dress hung in the wardrobe like a white ghost. Belgian lace, tiny hand-embroidered pearls, months of work her family could not afford, but which the Duke had generously financed. Generously. The word tasted like ashes in Charlotte's mouth. Harriet entered the room with a tea tray, her eyes shining with happy tears. "You look so beautiful, Charlotte." "Like a fairy tale princess." Charlotte forced a smile as her sister helped her with the dress. Princess. In fairy tales, princesses were pure, deserving of their happy endings. Charlotte felt like a fraud dressed in white. The last week had been strange. Thomas, the helpful butler, had disappeared suddenly, recalled by the Duke. And then Alexander Thornfield had arrived 3 days before the wedding. Charlotte had seen him for the first time in the drawing room of Pemberton Hall. A tall man, broad shoulders, dark brown hair with silver threads at the temples. Grey eyes like a distant storm. He had been courteous, cold, distant. No warmth, no attempt to truly know her. Just formalities, practical arrangements, discussions about the ceremony and the move to Ravenscroft Manor. Charlotte had expected coldness based on what she'd heard about him, but there was something more. Something that felt almost like contempt. She pushed the thought away. Bridal nerves, surely. The ceremony took place in the chapel at Ravenscroft Manor, small but exquisite, with stained glass windows that cast colourful rainbows on the ancient stone floor. There were few guests, a discreet wedding, as Alexander had preferred. Charlotte's family, some members of the local nobility. Beatrice sitting in the front pews with an encouraging expression. Charlotte walked down the aisle with leaden legs. Her father escorted her, his trembling hands gripping her arm. He was aging visibly, the weight of guilt bending his shoulders. This was his salvation. This marriage would pay his debts, secure Harriet's future, preserve what was left of the Pemberton name. Alexander waited at the altar, impeccable in dark attire. When Charlotte reached his side and met his eyes, something icy ran down her spine. There was no joy there, not even lukewarm cordiality, just a hardness that made her want to retreat. The vows were spoken in voices that echoed in the sacred space. Charlotte promised to love, honor, and obey. Each word was a counterfeit coin, and she felt like a thief stealing something sacred. Alexander repeated his vows with the same emotion he would use to recite a legal document. When the priest declared them husband and wife, the kiss was chaste, brief, cold as a knife's blade in winter. The feast that followed was refined torture. Charlotte smiled, acknowledged congratulations, accepted blessings for future happiness. Alexander remained by her side like an ice statue, responding in monosyllables, his fingers drumming on the wineglass he barely touched. Finally, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in oranges and purples, the moment Charlotte dreaded arrived, the wedding night. The room prepared for them at Ravenscroft Manor was magnificent. A burgundy velvet canopy, Egyptian linen sheets, a crackling fireplace casting dancing shadows. It should have been romantic. It was merely suffocating. Charlotte stood by the window, still in her wedding dress, fingers nervously toying with the fabric. She heard Alexander moving about the room, the sound of clothes being removed, water being poured into the basin. When she finally turned, he was in his shirt sleeves, damp hair clinging to his forehead, and in those grey eyes for the first time, she saw something beyond coldness. She saw anger. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Charlotte whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts. Alexander approached, but there was no affection in his movements. There was rigid control, containment of something violent. "Like what, Lady Thornfield?" The title sounded like an accusation. "As if you hate me." He stopped a few steps from her, so close Charlotte could feel his warmth, see the lines of tension around his mouth. "I hate lies," he said softly, dangerously. "I hate falsehood. I hate being taken for a fool." Charlotte's heart raced. There was knowledge in those words. But how? "I don't understand." "You don't understand." Alexander let out a humorless laugh. "How convenient. Innocence is always convenient, isn't it?" He turned, moving away from her, his hands clenching into fists. "This is your bedchamber," he said, gesturing to the magnificent bed. "Mine is down the hall. We will sleep separately. We will fulfill our obligations when necessary to produce an heir. But do not expect anything more from me than that." Charlotte felt tears burn her eyes. "We are married. You barely know me, and you already condemn me." He looked over his shoulder, and there was old pain in those eyes, mixed with something newer and angrier. "I know enough." And then he left, closing the door with a click that sounded like a final sentence. Charlotte sank onto the Persian rug, her wedding dress spreading around her like stained snow. The tears came then, silent but devastating. Married for only hours, and she already knew this was a gilded cage. She didn't understand that night the reason for his rejection. She didn't know about Thomas. She didn't know that her confessions to Beatrice had been overheard. She only knew that her husband despised her without explanation, and that the future stretching before her was black as pitch. Alexander in his room stayed awake until dawn. The image of Charlotte crying in her wedding dress was seared into his mind like a branding iron. Part of him wanted to go back, wanted to demand the truth from her. But pride kept him chained, and the pain of betrayal before they had even begun, burned hotter than any compassion. That was the first of many nights they would both lie awake in separate rooms, each carrying truths the other didn't know, each building walls that would soon become almost insurmountable. Almost. June brought wildflowers to the fields of Ravencroft, but inside the manor, winter reigned supreme. Charlotte moved through the corridors like a ghost, fulfilling her duties as Duchess with mechanical precision. She supervised the servants, reviewed household accounts, received visitors with smiles as false as glass pearls. Alexander barely looked at her. When they shared meals, a social duty they couldn't avoid, he spoke only what was strictly necessary: estate policies, financial matters, social events that required both their presences. He never asked how she had slept. He never noticed the dark circles under her eyes. He never saw how her hands trembled imperceptibly when she held her fork. Charlotte felt herself disappearing little by little, like ink exposed to the sun. With no purpose beyond existing, with no affection to support her existence, each day was a walk through dense fog where she could see no future. It was on a morning at the end of June that everything collapsed. Harriet had come to visit, cheerful as always, bringing family news and modest gifts. The sisters were having tea in the garden when Harriet innocently commented, "You know, Charlotte, Thomas was so helpful. The butler the Duke sent. He helped me find rare flower seeds for Mother's garden. I hope he returns someday." Charlotte smiled distractedly. "I don't remember any, Thomas." "Of course you remember," Harriet insisted, biting into a biscuit. "He was at Pemberton Hall for almost 2 weeks before the wedding. A tall man, broad shoulders, always so attentive. You even spoke with him several times." Something cold ran down Charlotte's spine. "Describe him better." Harriet, confused by the intensity of her tone, obeyed. As she spoke, the pieces began to fit together in Charlotte's mind like a macabre puzzle. Grey eyes, the way he held a teacup, a particular way of tilting his head when he listened. The blood drained from Charlotte's face. As soon as Harriet left, Charlotte marched directly to Alexander's study. She didn't knock. She simply opened the door with enough force to make it bang against the wall. Alexander looked up from his documents, surprised by the sudden intrusion. Charlotte had never dared such a thing before. "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling with restrained emotion. Harriet mentioned Thomas, the helpful butler who was at Pemberton Hall. Something passed through Alexander's eyes, surprise, then something darker. But he didn't deny it. Charlotte felt the world spin. "It was you, in disguise, spying on me. Getting to know my future wife," he corrected coldly, closing the document folder. Getting to know her true nature. Anger exploded in Charlotte like a long-dammed storm. "My true nature? You who built our entire marriage on a lie? You who hid like a coward instead of asking me directly? And would you have told me?" Alexander stood up, leaning his hands on the desk. "Would you have confessed about Edmund Grey? About your betrayal of Henry Sinclair? About the scandal your family paid to cover up?" The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte felt her legs falter. He knew. Dear God, he knew everything. I overheard," Alexander said, his voice sharp as glass. "Your conversation with Lady Beatrice. Every word. Every confession. Every plan to deceive me for the rest of our lives." Tears sprang to Charlotte's eyes, but now they were tears of anger, not shame. "And you judged me based on a conversation you overheard while hiding. Condemned me without giving me a chance to explain?" "Explain?" He laughed bitterly. "What explanation could justify betrayal? What explanation could justify cowardice?" Charlotte retorted, advancing. "You who sneaks around other people's houses in disguise, who judges without understanding, who builds walls before even knowing the person on the other side." Alexander rounded the desk, approaching her. There was anger in his movements, but also something Charlotte couldn't decipher. Pain, perhaps, disillusionment. "I made a mistake," Charlotte said, her voice breaking but firm. "A terrible mistake 8 months ago. I didn't love Edmund Grey. I never loved him. I didn't even like him. I was lost, Alexander, drowning in expectations, in pressures, in a future that seemed like a prison. And for one night, I believed the lies of a man who knew exactly what to say. And that should make me feel better?" Alexander asked, his voice low and dangerous. "No," Charlotte replied. "Nothing can make you feel better, because you don't want forgiveness. You want vindication. You want your perfect wife who never existed. Your dead Isabel who could never disappoint you because she never had to be imperfect, human, real." Isabel's name coming from Charlotte's lips was like a slap to Alexander's face. He froze, his eyes widening. Yes, I know about her, Charlotte continued, the tears flowing freely now. Everyone knows about the perfect, angelic, immaculate Isabel. And me, I'm just the imperfect replacement, the stained woman you despised before you even truly knew me. You lied, Alexander said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. And you didn't lie? Charlotte took a step forward. Our entire marriage is built on your lies just as much as on mine. The difference is I intended to be a good wife despite my past. You condemned me based on it. They stood face to face, both breathing heavily, both carrying truths as sharp as drawn swords. I don't know if I can forgive you, Alexander said finally, and for the first time there was raw honesty in his voice. And I don't know if I can forgive you, Charlotte replied. But we are married, before God and the law. And neither of us has the option to simply give up. Alexander turned, looking out the window at the gardens stretching beyond. Charlotte watched the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled imperceptibly. So what do we do? He asked, still not looking at her. Charlotte wiped her tears with the back of her hand. We start over, with honesty this time, however painful it may be. No masks, no disguises. No Thomas and no perfect Charlotte you imagined. I don't know if I can, Alexander repeated, but this time it sounded less like a refusal and more like a confession of fear. Then we will learn together, Charlotte said, or we will destroy each other trying, but at least it will be real. She left the study without waiting for an answer, leaving Alexander alone with thoughts that coiled like snakes. For the first time since the wedding, he questioned if his judgment had been fair. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, he himself was as guilty as the woman he had condemned. The truth, it turned out, was far more complex than either of them had imagined, and the path ahead would be long, painful, paved with difficult confessions and costly forgiveness. But for the first time, they both knew exactly where they stood, and sometimes knowing is the first step toward healing. The days following the confrontation were a cold war punctuated by moments of uneasy truce. Charlotte and Alexander moved around each other like dancers, choreographing steps in a dance they didn't yet know. July arrived with suffocating heat. The nights at Ravenscroft Manor became heavy, the air hot and still like an omen. Charlotte felt strange, a tiredness that didn't pass with rest. Morning nausea she attributed to the constant tension. It was Daniels, the silent observer, who noticed first. He approached her one morning, his expression gentle but knowing. "My lady," he said softly when they were alone in the library. "Should I call the physician?" Charlotte looked at him, confused. "I am not ill." His smile was paternal. "No, but I believe you are in a delicate condition." The realization came slowly, then all at once, pregnant. The world tilted on its axis. Charlotte pressed a hand against her still flat stomach, feeling the weight of a new life growing there, a life created on a night of cold, bitter duty, when Alexander had come to her room for the first time since the wedding, fulfilling an obligation without tenderness. The doctor confirmed it 3 days later. 8 weeks. The baby would arrive in February. Charlotte should have felt joy. Instead, she felt terror. Isabel had died in childbirth. James had lived only 2 breaths. And now she carried the air Alexander needed, but he didn't love her enough to fear losing her. The nightmares began. Dreams where she died bleeding, where the baby was born silent and blue, where Alexander looked at her with relief at being finally free. She would wake up soaked in sweat, biting pillows to keep from screaming. She didn't tell Alexander about the pregnancy. She didn't know how. She didn't know if he would be happy or just satisfied that he had fulfilled his obligation to produce an heir. It was on one particularly torturous night that everything changed. Charlotte was dreaming of blood, of pain, of darkness. In the dream, Alexander stood by her deathbed, impassive, tearless. And she tried to reach for him but couldn't, her voice lost, her existence fading like a candle. She woke up screaming. The scream ripped through the silence of Ravenscroft Manor like a knife. Alexander, whose room was 3 doors down, heard it through the walls. He was awake, as he always was in the days leading up to the anniversary of Isabel's death. For the past 5 years, that date was an annual reminder of his failure. Hearing Charlotte scream woke something instinctive in him. Before he could think, he was running down the hall barefoot, still in his shirt sleeves and sleeping trousers. He entered the room without knocking. Charlotte was sitting up in bed, her white nightgown clinging to her sweaty body, her eyes wide with terror, still half lost in the nightmare. "Charlotte," he said, his voice rough with a genuine concern that surprised him. She looked at him and something broke. Maybe it was pregnancy hormones. Maybe it was weeks of loneliness and fear. Maybe it was simply not being able to bear carrying it all alone anymore. "I'm going to die," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm going to die like your first wife, and you'll be happy to be rid of me. Alexander froze. What? I'm pregnant, Charlotte said, the words pouring out in a torrent. 8 weeks. And I'm going to die in childbirth because that's how it works. Isabel died. Her baby died. And now I'm going to die, and you'll have what you wanted. A wife who can no longer disappoint you. The shock on Alexander's face was genuine. He approached slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might flee. You think I would wish for your death? Why wouldn't you? She sobbed. You hate me. You despise me. You can barely look at me. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful but no longer insurmountable distance. I don't, he began, then stopped. How to explain the confusion in his chest? How to articulate that anger and a death wish were completely different things. I'm scared, Charlotte confessed, her voice small in the darkness. Terrified. And I have no one to talk to because my husband is a stranger who judges me for every imperfection. The words were like a punch to Alexander's gut. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled, the raw vulnerability she had tried to hide under a duchess's composure. I do not wish for your death, he said finally, his voice hoarse. I never have. Charlotte, I am angry, hurt, confused, but I would never ever wish for you to die. She met his eyes in the dim light, illuminated only by the moon. She searched for lies and found something different. Raw, uncomfortable, but real truth. Isabel didn't die because I didn't love her enough, Alexander continued, the words torn from him like thorns. She died because childbirth is dangerous, because sometimes there is nothing to be done. And I have carried that guilt like a cross for 5 years. You loved her so much, Charlotte whispered. I did, he confirmed, but she is gone. And you are here. Real, alive, imperfect, and terrifying, and so human it scares me. Charlotte hadn't expected this confession. I scare you? Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she was beginning to recognize. Everything about you scares me. Your mistakes scare me because they prove you are real, that you can disappoint me, that I can lose you not to death but to distance. Your strength scares me because it means I can hurt you, and you will still be alive carrying the wound. You scare me, Charlotte, in ways Isabel never did. Because it was easy to love a ghost, Charlotte said, understanding. Ghosts don't make mistakes. They don't betray. They don't disappoint. No, Alexander agreed. But they also aren't here. They don't laugh, they don't cry, they aren't pregnant with a child who could be our second chance or our mutual destruction. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Charlotte asked, vulnerable, Were you happy? About the news? Alexander pondered. Honesty she had asked for. Honesty he would give. Terrified, he admitted, because I don't know if I can go through it again. But also hopeful, perhaps stupidly hopeful. Charlotte let out a laugh that was half a sob. We're a pathetic pair, aren't we? We are, he agreed. And something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched his lips. Charlotte lay back down, exhausted. Will you stay? She asked softly. Just until I fall asleep? I can't face the nightmares alone tonight. Alexander should have refused. He should have kept his distance. But he looked at her, at his wife pregnant with his child, terrified and alone, and found that he couldn't. I'll stay, he said. He sat in the armchair by the bed, watching as Charlotte's breathing slowly evened out. She fell asleep with her hand on her belly, protecting a life they both feared losing. And Alexander stayed awake, a reluctant guardian, realizing that perhaps he hated less than he thought. Perhaps even somewhere deep he didn't want to examine, he was already beginning to care more than was safe. The dawn found them thus, Charlotte sleeping restlessly, Alexander vigilant beside her. It was not reconciliation, it was not forgiveness, but it was the first real step toward something that might one day resemble a true marriage. September painted the fields of Ravenscroft with golds and ambers, but inside the manor, a different tension was beginning to build. Charlotte was entering her 4th month of pregnancy, and the gentle curve of her belly could no longer be hidden. Alexander had become more present since that night. They weren't close. There were still many walls between them, but he checked on her in the morning. They dined together occasionally, and sometimes, just sometimes, he would stay when the nightmares assaulted her. Charlotte was beginning to see nuances in the man she had married. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her growing belly, how his hands trembled imperceptibly when they discussed the birth, how he still spoke with Daniels in a low voice about midwives and doctors and preparations, tangible fear in every word. He didn't love her, but he was beginning to care. And for Charlotte, drowning in loneliness for months, even crumbs of care felt like a feast. It was on a September afternoon that the past knocked on the door. Charlotte was in the garden, overseeing the planting of winter roses, when she heard a commotion coming from the main entrance. Male voices, one strangely familiar, the other, Alexander's, laden with barely concealed rage. Her blood ran cold. She approached slowly, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other holding her parasol like an unlikely weapon. And then she saw him. Captain Edmund Grey stood on the doorstep, immaculate uniform, hat under his arm, an arrogant smile etched on his conventionally handsome face. Alexander blocked his entrance, his posture rigid with ill-disguised threat. "I came to see Lady Charlotte," Edmund was saying, his voice as honeyed as ever. "Surely you can allow me to greet an old pay friend." The word friend carried dirty insinuations. Charlotte felt a nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. "You are not welcome here," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. It was then that Edmund saw Charlotte approaching. His eyes slid over her, lingering on her visible womb, and his smile widened with something cruel. "Lady Thornfield," he said, making an exaggerated bow. "Or should I call you Charlotte? After all, we knew each other, intimately." The world seemed to slow down. Charlotte saw Alexander stiffen, saw Daniels and 2 footmen appear in the doorways. Alerted by the tension, she saw her future teetering on the edge of a precipice. And something inside her, perhaps hormones, perhaps weeks of being judged, perhaps simply courage born from having nothing left to lose, exploded. "No," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You have no right to call me that. You have no right to be here. And you definitely have no right to imply there is any relationship between us beyond a mistake I regretted the second it occurred." Edmund blinked, surprised by her vehemence. "My dear, you don't need to pretend." "I am not pretending," Charlotte cut in, advancing until she stood side by side with Alexander. "I am stating facts. You, Captain Grey, took advantage of a vulnerable young woman nearly a year ago. You seduced her with lies, manipulated her when she was scared and alone, and now you come here to her home to imply what? That you have some claim on her, on me." "The child," Edmund began, and Charlotte saw his play. "Dirty, desperate, but effective if she allowed." "It is not yours," she said, each word a sentence. "It could never be yours. My child is my husband's, conceived months after you were forgotten as the shameful mistake you represent." Alexander looked at her, and Charlotte saw something change in his eyes, surprise, respect, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something warmer. Edmund realized he was losing control of the situation. "So you owe me nothing." Charlotte took a step forward and Edmund involuntarily recoiled. "I owe you absolutely nothing. I made a mistake with you. But my place, my loyalty, my future, everything is beside my husband. Now leave our property before I ask the guards to remove you physically." It was Alexander who moved then. He placed himself between Charlotte and Edmund, protective, possessive. "You heard my wife leave, and if I ever hear your name mentioned in connection with hers in any drawing room in London, in any club anywhere, I guarantee I will make sure your superior knows exactly what kind of man serves under his command." The threat was clear. Edmund, finally understanding he had no power there, backed down. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Charlotte said firmly. "It ended the moment I realized you were just a common man trying to make himself important by destroying others. Now go and never come back." Edmund left. With muttered curses and wounded pride, he mounted his horse and departed, raising a cloud of dust that quickly dissipated. Charlotte only trembled once he was out of sight. Her legs failed, and she would have fallen if Alexander hadn't caught her by the elbows. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tense with concern. Charlotte nodded, though she was far from all right. "I needed to do that. I needed to confront him, to say the things I didn't say back then." "You were magnificent," Alexander said softly, surprise evident in his tone. Charlotte looked at him, at this man who had judged and condemned her but who now looked at her with something akin to admiration. "Did you believe me when he implied about the baby?" Alexander studied her face. "The baby was conceived in May. You haven't seen Edmund in nearly a year. Basic mathematics." "But he could have planted doubt." "He could have," Alexander agreed. "But he didn't because—" He hesitated, as if the admission cost him dearly. "Because I'm starting to believe I know you better than that." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes. "You defended me. You defended yourself," he corrected. "I just was here." "It was enough," Charlotte whispered. "For the first time since we married, I felt we were on the same side." Alexander didn't respond with words. Instead, he did something he hadn't done since their wedding night. He touched her gently. His hand rested on her rounded belly, feeling the baby move slightly beneath his palm. "Our child," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not his. Not anyone else's. Ours." Charlotte covered his hand with hers. "Ours," she agreed. Daniels watched from the doorway, a discreet smile touching his lips. The footmen quietly returned to their duties. And in the gardens of Ravencroft, under the golden September sun, a couple began to build something new on the ruins of what had been destroyed. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was partnership. It was choice. It was the recognition that sometimes fighting for the same side creates bonds stronger than those born of easy passion. And in Charlotte's heart, for the first time, hope blossomed that maybe, just maybe, her marriage could become something real. The confrontation with Edmund Grey changed something fundamental between Charlotte and Alexander. It was as if an infected wound had finally been lanced, allowing fresh air to reach what was rotting underneath. October arrived with falling leaves and cooling air. Charlotte was visibly pregnant now, moving with the careful grace of someone carrying precious life. Alexander had become almost solicitous, ensuring she had extra pillows, that the fire was always lit in her rooms, that the best doctor in London was retained for the birth. But there were still walls, half-finished conversations, glances that didn't hold, unspoken truths that weighed like lead. It was on a stormy night that they finally faced them. Lightning cut through the sky, thunder rattling the windows. Charlotte was in the small drawing room, trying to read but unable to concentrate. Alexander entered, hair damp from being in the rain, checking on something in the stables. "You should be resting," he said, grabbing a towel to dry his hair. "I can't sleep," Charlotte replied. "The baby is restless." "Or maybe I am." Alexander sat in the armchair across from her, the crackling fireplace between them. For a long moment they just watched the flames dance. "I need to ask you something," Charlotte said finally. "And I need you to be honest with me." Alexander nodded, tense. "Why did you really go in disguise?" she asked. "And don't tell me it was just to know my nature. There was something more, wasn't there?" Alexander sighed, the sound rough and tired. "My cousin, Richard. He will inherit everything if I die without an heir. He is an irresponsible, indebted man who would waste in months what took generations to build." "And you needed an heir," Charlotte said, understanding. "I did, but also," he hesitated, "I was afraid of being deceived again." "Again?" Alexander looked into the fire, memories passing through his eyes. "Isabel was perfect, or I saw her that way. She never questioned, never challenged, always agreed with everything I said. And I loved that, the ease, the absence of conflict. Until she died," Charlotte whispered. "Until she died and I realized I never truly knew her," Alexander confessed. "I didn't know her fears, her real dreams, what kept her awake at night. I just accepted the version she presented because it was convenient. And when I lost her, I didn't know who I was mourning, the real woman or the idea I had built." Charlotte felt tears burn. "And you were afraid I would be another perfect facade." "I was," he confirmed. "That's why the disguise. I wanted to see the truth before I committed. And when I heard about Edmund, I felt my worst fears were confirmed. That I was a liar, a fortune hunter. That it would be another marriage built on lies," Alexander corrected. "That I would spend another life without knowing the woman beside me." Charlotte stood up with difficulty, moving until she stood before him. "Then ask me anything, everything. No judgments this time. Just honesty." Alexander looked up at her, at this woman pregnant with his child, brave and broken and unexpectedly strong. "Why? Why Edmund?" Charlotte sat on the arm of his chair, needing him to see her eyes when she spoke. "Because I was suffocating. My father had ruined us. Harriet needed a dowry. I was the only bargaining chip we had. Every man who looked at me saw property, lineage, a womb to produce heirs. No one saw Charlotte, the woman who liked to read poetry aloud, who was afraid of storms, who dreamed of traveling to places she would never see." She took a deep breath, the words flowing now. "Edmund was charming. He said I was more than my surname, that I was interesting, intelligent, desirable for myself. And I, God forgive me, believed him. For one night I allowed myself to be seen as a person instead of a business transaction. And after?" Alexander asked softly. "After I realized they were just words, that he seduced women as a hobby, that I was a conquest to brag about. Henry found out, someone saw us, and the scandal exploded. My family paid all the money, we didn't have to hush it up. Henry broke it off, of course. And her voice broke. "I learned that sometimes the price for a moment of freedom is a life sentence." Alexander raised his hand, hesitant, then laid it over hers. "And I added more chains. You were judge, jury, and executioner, based on a conversation overheard in secret," Charlotte said, but without anger now, just sadness. You condemn me for seeking to be human in a society that turns us into commodities. I was a coward, Alexander admitted. I hid behind my pain, my excuses, my fear. I judged you for one mistake while building our entire marriage on a lie. Charlotte turned to look at him directly. Do you forgive me? Truly? The question hung between them, heavy as lead. Alexander closed his eyes, thinking, perfect Isabel. Imperfect Charlotte. One was dead, idealized, untouchable. The other was here, real, flawed, alive. I am trying, he said finally, raw honesty. It doesn't happen instantly. But when I look at you now, I don't just see the mistake. I see you complicated, scared, brave. Real. And that is terrifying, because real can hurt me in ways ghosts never can. I'm afraid of you too, Charlotte confessed. Afraid of never being enough, of always being compared to the dead wife you've idealized, that every imperfection is proof that I made the wrong choice in letting Edmund touch me. Alexander stood, facing her. Then maybe we need to agree to be terrified together, to try even when it hurts, to build something new instead of mourning what might have been. Something real, Charlotte said. Something real, he agreed. And then, for the first time since he had found out about Edmund, Alexander leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion. It was acknowledgement. It was forgiveness beginning to be born. It was a promise to try. When they parted, both had tears in their eyes. We're going to mess this up again, Charlotte said with a wet laugh. Several times, probably. Probably, Alexander agreed. But maybe this time when we do, we can talk about it, instead of hiding behind walls. Agreed, Charlotte said. And on that stormy October night, as lightning lit the sky and thunder shook Ravencroft Manor too, strangers truly began to know each other. Not as Duke and Duchess, not as obligated husband and wife, but as Alexander and Charlotte, two broken people trying to find a way to fit together without losing their own pieces. It wasn't a happy ending. It was just a beginning. But sometimes a beginning is all we need. November brought frosts that drew lace patterns on the windows of Ravencroft Manor. Charlotte was in her 7th month of pregnancy, moving with a graceful slowness, one hand always resting on her belly where the baby kicked vigorously. Alexander rarely left her alone now, old fear mixed with genuine care. The conversations between them became easier. They dined together, shared stories from their childhoods, discovered common tastes. Both loved romantic poetry, both detested pompous social events, both had a surprisingly sarcastic sense of humor when they allowed it to show. Sometimes Alexander would read to her when the discomfort of pregnancy prevented her sleep. Sometimes Charlotte would correct his French pronunciation with a mischievous smile. Sometimes they just sat together in comfortable silence, mutual presence enough. It was in this state of fragile peace that Richard Thornfield arrived. Daniels announced him with a disapproving expression. Mr. Richard Thornfield requests an audience, Your Grace. Alexander stiffened immediately. Charlotte, who was embroidering tiny baby clothes in the drawing room, looked up with concern. She knew that name. The heir, should something happen to Alexander and his child, show him to the study, Alexander said coldly. Charlotte, stay here! But Charlotte rose with effort. If this concerns you, it concerns me. I'm going with you. Alexander looked ready to argue, then nodded. He was learning to recognize when Charlotte would not be dissuaded. Richard Thornfield was a corrupt version of his cousin. He had the same height, the same aristocratic bone structure, but where Alexander possessed dignity, Richard sported cheap arrogance. His waistcoat was too expensive, his hair too oily, his smile too calculating. Cousin, he greeted with a minimal bow, and the charming Duchess. I see you are productive. The look he cast at Charlotte's belly was insulting. She felt Alexander tense beside her. Richard, Alexander said, his voice icy, to what do we owe this unexpected visit? Richard settled into an armchair without being invited, as if he owned the place. I've heard interesting rumors. About you, cousin. About a certain disguise you used before the wedding. The air in the room grew heavy. Charlotte felt her heart quicken. I don't know what you're talking about, Alexander said carefully. No? Richard smiled like a predator. Thomas, the helpful butler, who happened to look extraordinarily like you, and who conveniently disappeared just as you appeared for your wedding. Those are serious accusations, Charlotte spoke, her voice firm despite her growing fear. And based on what, gossip? Servants' gossip can be extremely informative, Richard said, especially when well rewarded. Apparently, a young chambermaid who served at Pemberton Hall recognized your grace from the newspapers, found the resemblance to the temporary butler peculiar. Alexander clenched his fists. What do you want? Richard stood, moving to the window, striking a dramatic pose. Justice, truth, Ah, but those are expensive commodities, aren't they? Perhaps compensation to maintain silence about marital fraud would be more appropriate. Blackmail, Charlotte said, disgusted. Pragmatism, Richard corrected. Let's say £5,000, a modest sum for a wealthy duke, and a guarantee that certain secrets remain buried. And if we refuse? Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. Then I will take it to the ecclesiastical court, Richard said cheerfully. Fraud in the marriage vows. Marriage obtained under false pretenses. Annulment scandal, your pregnant duchess dishonored, your heir bastardized. Imagine the newspapers. It would be absolutely delicious. Charlotte felt nauseous, not from the pregnancy, but from the man's casual malice. She looked at Alexander, saw the struggle in his eyes. To pay was to admit guilt, to feed a parasite. To refuse was to risk everything. I have no proof, Charlotte said suddenly. Richard turned to her, surprised. I have testimony. From a maid who claims that my husband, a duke known for being reclusive and rarely photographed, looked like a temporary butler, Charlotte cut in. In court that would be laughed at, especially when we counterattack with your own vulnerabilities. My vulnerabilities? Richard laughed, but there was nervousness now. Your debts, Charlotte said. Your threats to creditors. The scandals you thought were buried. My husband is a duke, Mr. Thornfield. He has resources. And I, as you've discovered, do not scare easily. Alexander looked at Charlotte with something bordering on admiration. Then he turned back to Richard. My wife is right. You have nothing but gossip and greed. Richard lost some of his confidence. You wouldn't dare. We would, Alexander said calmly. But I will do you one better. Daniels, he called, and the butler appeared immediately as if he had been waiting outside. Present the documents. Daniels entered with a leather portfolio, opening it on the desk. Charlotte looked on, confused. Alexander motioned for her to look. They were financial records. Lists of Richard's debts, names of gambling houses, amounts borrowed from moneylenders, threats made when drunk, a complete dossier of minor crimes and major shames. I knew you would come, Alexander said. Men like you always do. That's why for the past few months I have invested in research. Surprising what well-applied money uncovers. Richard paled. You can't. I can, Alexander said. And I will if you force me. Here is my proposal. I will pay your debts. All of them. £15,000, I believe, is the total. Richard blinked. You will pay? I will pay. And in return, you will sign a formal renunciation of all rights to the Thornfield inheritance. You will be given a small property in Cornwall, a modest income to live decently if you manage it well. And you will never ever return to this place or mention my name in any context that is not respectful. And if I refuse, Richard tried to reclaim some bravado, then I will send these documents to every creditor you owe, to every newspaper in London, and to your superiors in the army, Alexander said. You will be ruined not only financially but socially. Choose. Richard looked at the documents. At Alexander. At Charlotte, who watched him with calm contempt. He realized he had no cards left to play. I need time to think. You have until the end of this week, Alexander said. After that the offer expires and the documents begin to circulate. Richard left with his dignity shaken, his back bent in defeat. When the door closed behind him, Charlotte let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You planned this, she said, admiration and relief mixed. Daniels planned it, Alexander corrected. When Richard started asking questions, Daniels took the initiative to investigate him. Men like him always have secrets. Do you think he'll accept? He has no choice, Daniels said from the corner where he had remained. £15,000 saves his life. Pride is an expensive commodity when one is drowning in debt. Charlotte sat down heavily, the tension finally hitting her. Alexander knelt before her, his hands covering hers. You were incredible, he said softly. You didn't let him intimidate us. Us, Charlotte said, testing the word. I like the sound of that. I do too, Alexander admitted. And when Richard returned 3 days later, signing the renunciation with trembling but defeated hands, Alexander and Charlotte watched together, united not just by marriage or by the baby growing between them, but by choice, by a shared fight, by a partnership forged in the fire of adversity. November turned into December, and for the first time since they were married, both allowed themselves to feel something dangerously close to hope. December arrived with snow that transformed Ravenscroft Manor into a fairy tale castle. Bare trees wore white, the lake froze into a mirror of ice, and inside the manor Christmas preparations mingled with more urgent ones. The baby was due in a matter of weeks. Harriet came for the festivities, bringing a youthful joy Charlotte hadn't realized she needed so much. The young woman marveled at her sister's immense belly, making the baby kick her hand with delighted laughs. "You seem happy," Harriet observed one afternoon as they sewed by the fire. Charlotte looked at her sister, surprised. "I do. Yes, different from when I visited before." "Then you seemed empty. Now there's something in your eyes, life." Charlotte thought about it. "I think I am. Happy, I mean. Or at least, no longer miserable." "And the Duke? Does he treat you well?" "He does," Charlotte said softly, and it was true. Alexander had become attentive in ways she never imagined. He insisted she not walk too much, that she rest frequently. He read to her at night when the discomfort prevented sleep. He held her hand when the fear of childbirth assaulted her. He had not declared love. Charlotte didn't expect him to. But there was affection there, respect, and something deeper that neither of them named but both felt growing slowly. Christmas Eve was magical. Snow fell gently. The Christmas tree shone with candles and old ornaments. The singing of carolers drifted from the nearby village. Charlotte wore a green velvet dress fitted over her belly. Alexander wore a cravat she had chosen just because she had asked. After dinner, when Harriet had retired, tired, Charlotte and Alexander remained in the drawing room watching the fire. "You know," Charlotte said softly, "this is my first happy Christmas in years." Alexander looked at her, the reflection of the flames dancing in his eyes. "Why?" "Because I'm not alone," she replied. "Because there's something to look forward to. Because you are here, and that matters more than I thought it would." Alexander took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Charlotte, But whatever he was going to say was interrupted. Charlotte arched, her breath catching, her hand flying to her belly. What is it?" Immediate panic in Alexander's voice. "I think..." Another grip, stronger. "The baby. It's coming." Alexander's world tilted. Too early. Much too early. It was almost 3 weeks early. "Daniels!" His shout echoed through the manor. "Get the doctor now!" What followed was a blur of activity. Daniels was already running before Alexander finished shouting. Maids appeared with linens, hot water, everything they had prepared for this moment. Harriet woke up startled, her eyes wide with fear. Alexander carried Charlotte to the bedroom. She clung to his neck, her breath short and gasping. "Alexander, I'm scared." "I know," he said, his voice thick. "I am too." "But you are strong. Stronger than I ever thought. You will get through this." "What if—" "No," he cut in firmly, laying her on the bed. "Don't say it. Don't think it. You will survive. Our child will survive. I will ensure it." The doctor arrived with surprising speed. Alexander had kept him practically in residence for the past few weeks. Dr. Morrison was a man in his 50s, experienced, calm in a crisis. "Your Grace," he said gently to Alexander, "you need to wait outside." "No," Alexander refused. "I'm staying." "Alexander?" Charlotte gasped between contractions. "You can't." "I can and I will," he said, holding her hand like a lifeline. "Isabel died alone, scared. I was in the hallway following stupid protocols about men not entering birthing rooms. I will not do that again. If you want me to go, ask. But if you don't, I'm staying." Charlotte met his eyes through the pain. "Stay," she whispered. "Please stay." And so Alexander stayed, holding her hand as the night turned into an eternity. He wiped her face with damp cloths. He murmured encouragement when she screamed. He absorbed insults when the pain made her curse. Hours passed. 3, 4, 5. The snow continued to fall outside, the world silent and white and oblivious to the drama inside Ravencroft Manor. "I can't," Charlotte cried at some point, exhausted beyond words. "Alexander, I can't anymore." "You can," he said fiercely. "Charlotte Thornfield, you are the woman who confronted Edmund Grey without blinking, who faced Richard without bowing, who forgave me when I didn't deserve it. You can do this." And maybe it was the confidence in his voice, or maybe just her body finally cooperating, but something changed. Dr. Morrison positioned himself, firm instructions, and then a cry, not from Charlotte, but a small, furious, gloriously alive cry. "Her girl," Dr. Morrison announced, smiling. "Healthy, perfect." Alexander froze. A girl, alive, Charlotte alive, everything alive. The doctor placed the baby in Charlotte's arms, a small pink bundle with clenched fists and a wrinkled face. Charlotte looked at her daughter, tears streaming down her face, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and overwhelming, instant love. Charlotte couldn't find the words. Alexander approached, looking at the tiny life he had helped create, and something inside him, something trapped for 5 years, finally broke. Tears ran down his face without shame. "Isabel," he said, his voice thick. "Isabel, Charlotte. If you agree, Charlotte looked at him through her own tears. Honoring who came before but starting something new. Yes, Alexander said. Isabel Charlotte Thornfield. Charlotte tested the name. It's perfect. The baby chose that moment to open tiny eyes, looking up with cloudy curiosity. Charlotte laughed, a sound of pure joy. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping an arm around Charlotte, looking at the daughter she held. I didn't lose her, he said, all coloring every word. I didn't lose you. You didn't, Charlotte agreed. I'm here. Our daughter is here. We are all here. Alexander leaned in, kissing Charlotte with a gentleness that held promises. When they parted, she saw something new in his eyes, something that would look like love if he allowed it to grow. Merry Christmas, he said softly. Charlotte laughed, though exhausted. The best present I could imagine. Harriet was allowed in, marveling at her niece. Daniels peeked through the door with a paternal smile. Maids whispered happily. And in the small cradle prepared near the bed, Isabel Charlotte Thornfield slept, oblivious to the fact that her birth marked more than the beginning of a life. It marked the rebirth of a marriage, the rebirth of hope. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the world in pure white. A new beginning, a new chance. And inside Ravencroft Manor, 3 hearts beat in unison, forming a family born not of perfection but of forgiveness, not of ease but of the deliberate choice to try. It was Christmas, and for the first time in a long time, Alexander Thornfield believed in miracles. The spring of 1826 burst over Ravencroft Manor in a cascade of color and life. 8 years had passed since that Christmas when Isabel Charlotte was born, 8 years of gradual but profound transformations. The gardens shone under the April sun, and in them a scene of joyous chaos was unfolding. Isabel, now 7, chased her brother Thomas Henry with serious determination. The girl had inherited her father's grey eyes and the tenacious resolve of both parents. Thomas Henry, at 5, ran with laughs that echoed through the rose bushes, his brown curls flying. Got you! Isabel declared triumphantly, tackling her brother. No fair, you're bigger, Thomas protested, but laughing. Life isn't fair, Isabel replied with all the seriousness of her 7 years. Father said so. Near the fountain, Eleanor Grace, 3 years of pure mischief, was trying to feed the ducks with biscuits that were supposedly for tea. Her dress was already dirty with mud, and Charlotte had given up on keeping her clean for more than 5 minutes at a time. And in Charlotte's arms, James Alexander, a baby of just 1 year, babbled happily, fat fingers trying to grab her pearl necklace. Charlotte, at 29, sat on a garden bench, watching the scene with a smile she had never imagined possible 8 years ago. Her hair had a few premature silver threads. Alexander joked they were the children's fault. Her body bore the marks of 4 pregnancies, but it also carried a piece she had never had as a young woman. Alexander approached from behind, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. At 44, his hair was decidedly grey at the temples, lines around his eyes that Charlotte said were from smiling so much. Our little wild horde, he said affectionately, watching the children. Our family, Charlotte corrected, leaning back against him. Alexander sat beside her, James immediately trying to climb into his father's lap. Remember our first Christmas together, when Isabel was born and we thought the world would end? Charlotte smiled. How could I forget? I didn't know, Alexander said softly. I didn't know love could look like this. Messy, complicated, real. Charlotte turned to look at him. After 8 years, she was still discovering new reasons to love him. It hadn't been easy. There had been arguments, moments of frustration, old wounds that occasionally reopened. But there had also been growth, understanding, and a love that deepened precisely because it hadn't been easy. Thomas Henry wants to know about his name, Charlotte said suddenly. Alexander laughed. What did you tell him? That we would talk about it together. Isabel, ever attentive, overheard and approached. I want to know too. Why do I have the name of an aunt I never met? Thomas Henry joined them, curious. Eleanor tried to follow but was distracted by a butterfly. James just drooled happily. Alexander looked at Charlotte, a silent question. She nodded. They were ready. Sit down, Alexander said, and the children settled on the grass at their feet, eyes wide with expectation. Before I met your mother, Alexander began, I was married to another woman. Her name was Isabel, like you, my dear. He touched his daughter's head. She was kind and good. And she died bringing my first child into the world. His name was James. He looked at the baby in his lap. Found he lived only 2 days. The children grew quiet, sensing the weight of the story. I was very sad, Alexander continued, for a long time. And when I met your mother, I wasn't very kind to her. Why? Thomas asked, indignant. Mother is wonderful. Charlotte laughed softly. Father was afraid of being hurt again, so he decided to disguise himself as a butler to get to know me before the wedding. Disguised? Isabel's eyes widened. Like a spy. Something like that, Alexander admitted. I called myself Thomas. That's why you have that name, my son. To remind me that sometimes we do foolish things when we're afraid, but we can learn from them. What did you learn? Isabel asked seriously. Alexander exchanged a look with Charlotte. I learned that true love doesn't come from perfection. It comes from choosing someone, flaws and all, and deciding to build something together. Your mother made mistakes. I made mistakes, but we chose to forgive each other and try again. And again, Charlotte added. And again, because that's what family does. Thomas Henry thought about it. So our names are reminders of people you lost and mistakes you made. They are reminders, Charlotte agreed, that we honor the past without being prisoners of it, that we grow through difficulties, that real love survives imperfections. Eleanor, finally joining the conversation, though not fully understanding, declared, I like my name. Eleanor Grace, Charlotte said, kissing the top of her head, because grace is what saved us. The grace to forgive and be forgiven. Isabel hugged Alexander's knees. Do you still love each other, even after all the mistakes? Alexander looked at Charlotte over his daughter's head, especially after all the mistakes. Maybe even more because of them. Because the mistakes taught us who we really were, Charlotte said. They broke our masks. And we found real people underneath. This is confusing, Thomas declared. You'll understand when you're older. Alexander laughed. Adults always say that, Thomas grumbled, but he smiled. The children eventually dispersed again, returning to their games. James fell asleep in Alexander's lap, his peaceful, rosy cheeks. Charlotte and Alexander remained on the bench, watching their family. Are you happy? Charlotte asked softly. Truly? Alexander didn't answer immediately. He thought about 8 years, about 4 births, each progressively less terrifying, about arguments and reconciliations, about nights laughing together over some foolishness of the children, about mornings waking up next to her and feeling gratitude. I am, he said finally, in ways I never imagined possible. It's not the perfect happiness of fairy tales. It's better. It's real. Charlotte leaned in, kissing him softly. I still remember that butler Thomas sometimes. And I still remember the young woman I overheard confessing to Beatrice, Alexander admitted. But now those memories don't hurt. They're just part of how we got here. The journey matters as much as the destination, Charlotte said philosophically. When did you become so wise? He teased. When you stopped being so stubbornly proud, she retorted. They laughed, a sound that echoed through the gardens where their children played. Ravencroft Manor was no longer a silent fortress of grief. It was a living, breathing home full of laughter and tears and glorious imperfections. You know, Alexander said after a moment. Richard wrote. Charlotte turned, surprised. After all these years. To thank me, Alexander said, surprise in his own voice. Apparently, being forced to live within his means taught him responsibility. He's married, has children. He's happy, it seems. People can change, Charlotte said softly. They can, Alexander agreed. We are proof of that. The sun began to set, painting the sky with oranges and pinks. Daniels appeared to announce that tea was served. The children ran inside, hungry as always. Charlotte and Alexander walked slowly behind them, hands intertwined, James sleepy in Alexander's arms. Do you regret it? Charlotte asked suddenly. All of it? The disguise, the pain, the hard path we walked? Alexander stopped, turning to face her fully. I regret the parts where I hurt you. But the rest? No, because every step, however painful, brought us here. And here. He looked at the house full of children's voices, of life, of love. Here is exactly where I need to be. Charlotte smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Me too. They entered together, leaving the gardens to the twilight. And as spring advanced on Ravencroft Manor, 2 people who began as strangers forced to marry ended as partners who chose every day to keep choosing each other. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that made it precious. August of 1826 brought a golden warmth that turned the fields of Ravencroft into a sea of wheat, swaying gently in the breeze. Charlotte and Alexander had decided to have a picnic by the lake, which sparkled like a mirror under the afternoon sun. The children played in the shallow water, under the watchful eye of 2 nursemaids. Isabel, ever responsible, held Eleanor's hand tightly. Thomas built mud castles with architectural seriousness. James tried to eat sand and needed to be constantly redirected. Peace, Alexander said, stretched out on the blanket beside Charlotte. Remember when this seemed impossible? Charlotte laughed, her fingers playing with the soft grass. I remember when silence meant tension. Now it just means the children are focused on not bothering us for 5 minutes. Valuable 5 minutes, Alexander agreed, turning on his side to look at her. Charlotte wore a simple cotton dress, her hair loose in a casual braid, a straw hat protecting her face from the sun. In Alexander's eyes, she was more beautiful than ever. Not with the polished beauty of youth, but with something deeper. The beauty of a woman who had known pain and overcome it, who had laughed and cried and lived completely. "What are you thinking about?" Charlotte asked, catching him watching. "That I am a lucky man," he said honestly. "Lucky?" Charlotte arched an eyebrow. "I remember you calling me a disappointment." "I never said that," Alexander protested. "You didn't have to. It was in every cold glance, every clipped word." Charlotte said it not with anger, just remembering facts. Alexander sat up, his expression serious. "I was a fool." "You were," she agreed cheerfully. "But you learned?" "I learned that judgment based on fear says more about the one judging than the one being judged," Alexander said. "I learned that everyone deserves a second chance. And sometimes a third, fourth, fifth. I'm on my 100th, Charlotte joked. "And so am I," he retorted. "Maybe that's why we work. Both too flawed to judge each other's flaws." Charlotte laughed, a happy sound that echoed across the water. One of the things Alexander loved most about her was how she laughed now, freely, without restraint. The first months of their marriage she rarely laughed, and when she did it was a controlled, polite sound. Now she laughed with her whole body, eyes shining, not worrying if it was too loud or too enthusiastic. "Beatrice is visiting next week," Charlotte said. "With her new husband, Lord Howard, finally captured after years of determined bachelorhood." "That will be an interesting conversation," Alexander commented dryly. "Considering her last advice was for you to never tell me about Edmund." "Poor advice it turned out to be," Charlotte agreed. "But she thought she was protecting me. She thought kept secrets were safer than risky truths." "And now you know she was wrong?" Charlotte considered. "Now I know that truths can hurt, but lies rot from the inside. I prefer the clean pain of honesty to the slow poisoning of falsehood." "Wise words," Alexander said. "You should write a book." "Maybe I will," Charlotte replied thoughtfully. "About women who make mistakes and learn to live with the consequences. About men who build walls and learn to tear them down. About marriages that begin out of necessity, but turn into a choice." "Write it," Alexander encouraged. "The world needs honest stories. Stories about imperfection that don't end in tragedy, but end in hope," Charlotte completed. Isabel ran up to them, her dress wet, hair streaming. "Mother!" Thomas pushed Eleanor into the water. "She pulled down my castle." Thomas defended himself, also soaked. "He started it!" Eleanor shouted, happy and completely covered in mud. Charlotte and Alexander exchanged the look of tired but amused parents. "You are all going to take a bath before dinner," Charlotte said. "And I don't want to hear any more fighting." "But Mother—" "No buts," Alexander backed her up. "Go and take James before he eats another handful of sand." The children retreated, arguing amongst themselves but obedient. The nursemaids followed with tested patience. "Remember when your biggest worry was what dress to wear to the next ball?" Alexander asked. "I remember when your biggest worry was finding a wife who wouldn't disappoint you," Charlotte retorted. "Look where we ended up. 4 children, permanently stained clothes, and no balls in months because we're too exhausted." "Perfect," Alexander said. "Imperfect," Charlotte corrected. "But ours." They remained by the lake as the sun slowly descended. They spoke of trivial things, repairs needed on the estate, a letter from Harriet about her own happy marriage, plans for the children's holidays. But between the trivial words there was depth, an intimacy built over years of truly knowing each other, of seeing past the masks to the real people and choosing to love them anyway. "Alexander," Charlotte said softly as the sun touched the horizon, "do you still think about her? About Isabel?" It was a question she had avoided for years, but now with solid trust between them, she could ask without fear. Alexander considered honestly. "I do, but not in the way I used to. No longer with crushing guilt or cruel comparisons. I think of her with gratitude, I suppose, for teaching me to love, even if imperfectly, for giving me a reason to go on after she left, and with sadness for what she lost, for never having the chance to live a full life. Would she have loved it, the life we have now?" "I don't know," Alexander admitted. "She was a different person. I was a different person. Maybe we would have been happy in a simpler, more superficial way. But it never would have been this. And you prefer this?" Alexander looked at her, at the estate behind them where children laughed and shouted. "I prefer complex reality to simple fantasy. Always. You taught me that." Charlotte leaned in, kissing him with a tenderness that 8 years of marriage had transformed from novelty into depth. "I love you," she said. "Not despite our difficult beginning, but perhaps because of it. because it forced us to build something true. I love you, Alexander replied, and every day I choose to love you again. That's the part fairy tales don't tell, that love isn't a single moment of passion. It's thousands of small choices to stay, to try, to forgive, to grow together, Charlotte agreed. They walked back to the manor in the twilight, hands intertwined, steps synchronized. Ahead of them, Ravencroft Manor glowed with lights from the windows, a promise of home and family. And as they entered, Charlotte realized she finally understood what it meant to be home. It wasn't a place. It was a person. It was a choice. It was the imperfect journey that had brought her here. It was Alexander with all his flaws and strength. It was her children, chaotic and beloved. It was the life they had built on foundations of painful truth and costly forgiveness. It was finally real. September arrived with winds that announced the approach of autumn. Charlotte was in the library reviewing letters when a messenger brought an envelope with an unfamiliar seal. She opened it with curiosity, then paled. Alexander entered minutes later, finding her pale, the letter trembling in her hands. What happened? Immediate concern in his voice. Edmund, Charlotte whispered. He's dead. Alexander sat down heavily. How? Charlotte read the letter, her voice trembling. A fever, it seems. 2 months ago. This letter is from his brother, Edmund. She swallowed. On his deathbed, he confessed several things. Women he seduced, lies he told. He asked his brother to send apologies to the women he had hurt, including me. Alexander read the letter over her shoulder. It was curiously touching, written by a man genuinely sorry for his brother's sins. How do you feel? Alexander asked carefully. Charlotte went to the window, looking out at the gardens where Isabel was chasing butterflies. Relief, mostly. He can never show up threatening us again, never be a shadow over our past. And also, sadness, I suppose, not for him specifically, but for the wasted life. He could have been better. He chose not to be. And the apology. Alexander approached. Do you accept it? Charlotte thought for a long time. I accept it in the sense that I no longer carry anger. He can't hurt me now. But forgiving is complicated. Forgiving doesn't mean what he did was acceptable. It means I will no longer allow it to define who I am. A wise decision, Alexander said softly. I learned from you. Charlotte turned to him. You forgave me for something that also involved Edmund, and that forgiveness, it changed everything. Alexander pulled her into a hug. We changed each other. For the better, I hope. Definitely for the better, Charlotte murmured against his chest. But that night Charlotte had old nightmares. She relived that fateful night with Edmund. The shame, the regret, the devastation when Henry found out. She woke up screaming. Alexander was there instantly, as he always was in recent years. Charlotte, I'm here. I see him, she sobbed. I still see him sometimes. Not Edmund specifically, but the mistake, the version of me that made that choice. You were 20, Alexander said firmly, holding her face so she would look at him. Scared, pressured, manipulated by a man experienced in seduction. Have you stopped punishing yourself? I try, she whispered. But sometimes the past still hurts, Alexander completed. I know. I still have nightmares about Isabel dying, about not being able to save her, about James living only days. The past doesn't disappear completely, but it doesn't have to rule us. Charlotte hugged him tightly. How did you become so wise? 8 years married to you, he replied, and 4 children who test my patience daily. Wisdom comes from survival. She laughed through her tears. I love you. I love you, he replied, and tomorrow we will answer Edmund's brother's letter. We will thank him for the apology, and then we will file this all away and move on. Together, Charlotte said. Always together, Alexander confirmed. The days that followed were ones of gradual closure. Charlotte wrote a polite but firm reply. She thanked him for the apology, but made it clear that chapter was definitively closed. She talked with Beatrice when her friend visited, finally having an honest conversation about that terrible advice years ago. I was wrong, Beatrice admitted. I thought protecting secrets was protection, but you taught me that truth, however painful, is always better than a lie. You thought you were helping me, Charlotte said generously, and in a way your advice led to everything that came after. If Alexander hadn't overheard, we never would have confronted our truths. We never would have built what we have now. So you are happy? Beatrice asked. Truly? Charlotte looked at Alexander, playing with the children in the garden, Isabel hanging on his back, Thomas trying to climb his legs, Eleanor demanding attention, James in his arms pulling on his father's cravat. I am, Charlotte said with absolute certainty, in ways I never imagined possible. That night, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Charlotte and Alexander sat together in the study. She had brought all the letters. Edmund's, the replies, even the original marriage proposal letter from years ago. "Should we burn them?" Alexander suggested. Charlotte considered. "No, let's keep them. Not as open wounds, but as reminders of where we started, of how far we've come." "Reminders that we survived," Alexander said. "More than survived," Charlotte corrected. "We thrived. Despite everything, because of everything, we thrived." They put the letters in a cedar box, closing it carefully. Then they took it to the attic, where it would join other memories, old portraits, childhood toys, christening gowns, part of the past. Not forgotten, but also no longer governing the present. As they descended the stairs, Alexander stopped Charlotte. "You know we have to tell the children eventually. About everything? About Edmund, about my disguise, about how complicated our beginning was." "We will tell them," Charlotte agreed, "when they are old enough to understand. So they know that family isn't perfection. It's forgiveness. It's choice. It's love that survives storms." "Good lessons," Alexander said. "The best," Charlotte agreed. And as they entered their chambers, not separate rooms as in the early days, but a shared room for years now, both felt an old weight finally lift completely. The past was at peace. The present was rich. The future shone with promise. And two people who began as strangers united by necessity ended as partners united by choice, love, and a deep understanding that sometimes the best destinations come from the most difficult journeys. Spring of 1834. 16 years since that rainy day when Charlotte first read Alexander's proposal. The gardens of Ravenscroft Manor exploded in white and pink roses, silent witnesses to all that had happened within those walls. Charlotte stood by the drawing-room window, a position echoing that from so long ago at Pemberton Hall, but everything else was different. She was 37 now, soft lines around her eyes from smiling so much, her hair more silver than brown. But her eyes shone with a contentment the young Charlotte had never known. Today was a special day. Isabel, now 15 and frighteningly intelligent, was having her debut ball. Not because she needed to hunt for a rich husband to save the family. Ravenscroft was more prosperous than ever. But because it was tradition, and Charlotte and Alexander had discovered that some traditions could be meaningful when chosen freely. "Mother?" Isabel entered, a whirl of white muslin and nervousness. "Do you think I'll trip?" "Harriet says I tripped over everything when I was her age." Charlotte laughed, adjusting the pearl necklace on her daughter's neck. "You are far more graceful than I ever was. And even if you trip, it won't be the end of the world. Believe me, I've seen ends of the world. Tripping isn't one of them." "Are you talking about when you married father?" Isabel asked with her typical insight. Charlotte and Alexander had eventually told their children an edited but honest version of their story. How the marriage had begun out of necessity. How there had been secrets and pain. How they had worked to build something real. "I'm talking about when I thought mistakes defined who I was," Charlotte said. "And I learned that we define who we are by the choices we make after the mistakes." Isabel hugged her mother impulsively. "You are strong, Mother. I want to be like you. Be better," Charlotte whispered. "Learn from my mistakes. Don't hide who you are. Don't let fear of judgment make you small." "I promise," Isabel said. Later, as the guests began to arrive, Charlotte watched her daughter dance in the Ravenscroft ballroom, decorated with thousands of candles and flowers. Isabel was radiant, laughing with a freedom Charlotte envied. She carried no weight of impoverished families, no need to sell herself to the highest bidder. Alexander approached, offering a glass of champagne. "What are you thinking about?" "That we gave her something neither of us had," Charlotte replied, "the freedom to choose her own path." "Thomas asked if I used to dress as a butler," Alexander commented with amusement. "Apparently he heard the story from the older servants." Charlotte laughed. "And what did you say?" "That I did. That I made a stupid choice based on fear. And that it was the best stupid thing I ever did because it brought me his mother." "Romantic," Charlotte teased. "Honest," Alexander corrected. "I've learned that honesty is more important than romanticism." They danced together later, a movement so natural after years of practice. The ballroom spun around them. Isabel, chatting animatedly with young gentlemen. Thomas trying to steal sweets without being noticed. Eleanor dancing with anyone who asked. James watching everything with the seriousness of his 9 years. "Happy?" Alexander murmured as they waltzed. "Extremely," Charlotte replied. "And you?" "More than I deserve to be," he said. "We deserve exactly this," Charlotte corrected firmly. "We fought for it. We chose it. We built it with honesty and forgiveness and hard work. We deserve every happy moment." Alexander looked at her with a love so deep it sometimes still surprised her. "You saved me, you know. From that night when I confronted you about Edmund, when you refused to be shamed, when you demanded I see you as a real person. You saved me from living as a ghost." "And you saved me," Charlotte said, "when you chose to stay despite everything, when you worked to forgive me, when you gave me a family, a home, a love that had no conditions." "We saved each other," Alexander said. "The best way," Charlotte agreed. The night moved on in celebration. After the last guest had left and the children were asleep, Charlotte and Alexander walked in the gardens under a silver moonlight. "Remember that first night?" Charlotte asked. "When you could barely look at me." "I remember being a fool," Alexander sighed, "wasting months we could have used to get to know each other. But I also remember," Charlotte continued, "you staying when I had nightmares about the birth. Your hand holding mine as Isabel was born. Every small step that brought us here." "The journey matters," Alexander said. "As much as the destination," Charlotte agreed. They stopped by the lake where decades before they had picnicked with small children. The water reflected the moon perfectly, golden and serene. "If you could go back," Alexander asked suddenly, "and change how we started, meet properly, court, marry with honesty from the beginning, would you change it?" Charlotte considered carefully. "No, because then we would have a different marriage. Easier, perhaps, but not as deep, not as real. Our struggle gave us a depth that ease never could." "I wouldn't change it either," Alexander admitted, "as painful as those first months were, because they forced us to build solid foundations instead of relying on superficial passion." "We are survivors," Charlotte said with pride. "We are thrivers," Alexander corrected. They walked back to the manor slowly, unhurried. In their room, Charlotte sat at her dressing table, removing her jewelry. Alexander watched her reflection in the mirror as she let down her hair. "Charlotte Thornfield," he said softly, "do you know that I love you more with each passing day?" She turned to look at him directly. "Show me." And he did, not just that night, but in the decades to come. He showed her in 1,000 small ways, in caring for her when she was ill, in making her laugh when she was sad, in respecting her opinions even when they disagreed, in choosing to be present in all moments, big and small. Charlotte returned it in kind, in patience when he grew grumpy, in humor when he took himself too seriously, in comfort when old nightmares returned, in a love that deepened like wine, growing richer with age. Years passed. Isabel married for love, a young poet whom Charlotte adored and Alexander tolerated with good humor. Thomas pursued a military career with honor, unlike the Edmund Gray who had haunted the beginning of their story. Eleanor became an artist, painting family portraits that captured the soul beyond the appearance. James studied medicine, determined to save lives that other doctors could not. Charlotte finally wrote her book, not an autobiography, but a novel about an imperfect woman who married an embittered man, and both learned that true love came not from perfection, but from the daily choice to stay and grow. It was a small success, touching women who also carried the burdens of social judgment and impossible expectations. Alexander became a respected statesman, a defender of reforms that helped impoverished families. They said it was because he understood the weight of necessity, of choices forced by circumstance, and through it all they remained partners, not always agreeing, not always harmonious, but always together. When Charlotte was 60 and Alexander 68, they sat again in the drawing room where so many important conversations had taken place. Grandchildren played in the gardens now, the cycle continuing. "Did you have a good life?" Alexander asked, his voice rougher with age but his eyes still sharp. "I had a real life," Charlotte replied, "with pain and joy mixed, with mistakes and lessons, with you. I can't imagine anything better." "Neither can I," Alexander said. And years later, when it was time for Charlotte to depart first, peacefully in her sleep surrounded by family, Alexander held her hand until the end. "I will find you again," he whispered. She squeezed his hand weakly. "And we'll start honestly this time," she joked with a final breath. Alexander lived 3 more years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried on a legacy not of perfection, but of resilience, of a love that survived the test of time not by being easy, but by being true. And when he finally joined Charlotte, as he believed he would, he imagined her receiving him, not as a perfect duchess, but as the imperfect, wonderful Charlotte, the woman who taught him that true love comes not despite flaws, but through them. At Ravenscroft Manor, the gardens continued to bloom. Future generations told the story of Alexander and Charlotte, of the Duke who disguised himself as a butler, the Duchess who carried painful secrets, and how they both chose truth over fantasy, forgiveness over pride, real love over idealized love. And the lesson remained. echoing through the years, that sometimes the truest stories aren't about perfect princesses and charming princes. They are about broken people finding a way to fit together, mending each other with threads of honesty, patience, and the daily choice to remain. They are stories about us, imperfect, human, real, and for that they are the most beautiful of all.